We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have with us Josh Abbotoy. I hope I said that right. I haven't actually heard it pronounced. Is that right, Josh?
You did. Yeah, that's
Very
spot
good.
on.
Josh has a career in real estate investment world, but is involved in something called the American Reformer, something that he has started. But before we jump into that and what American Reformer is doing, tell us a little bit about yourself so that we know a little bit more who we're hearing from, your education, your family, and your career.
Certainly. I was blessed to grow up in a Christian household. Actually, my parents, this may be important, my parents met in Berkeley, California in the 80s at a Calvary Chapel church. You know, my mom was in the radical movements out there and, came to the Lord actually, adjacent to the Jesus People movement and all of this. And, my parents were always sort of crunchy conservatives. As long as I can remember, I was homeschooled all the way through. I grew up in church, lived most of my life different places, but most of it has been in Tennessee. So on a hobby farm and all of this. Received a wonderful education. I went to a small Southern Baptist college, Union University in Jackson for undergrad. Uh, After that, I went and did a luxury master's degree at Catholic University. Was actually thinking about going into the academy. I was in the PhD program, had funding. But left the program in part because I had the prospect of kids on the horizon. But I also, I'd also say, even in that early days in 2009, 2010, I was seeing the effects of critical theory strangling what I expected to be sort of this relatively safe discipline, reading old medieval sources, Greek sources and such, but the critical theory actually that was already dominant in the field was one of the big factors that actually pushed me away. Ultimately went to law school, went to Harvard Law School, graduated that in 2015, went and worked in the oil and gas business in Houston, Texas, working for private equity and folks like that, essentially going almost the opposite direction that you could. But law is fun. I mean, law is extremely logical, especially at the high ends when you're doing complex contract negotiation and such. It's actually a very interesting logical exercise. And I did that, and I started sort of working my way into the business world from the law angle. So from the big law firm, I went in-house to a portfolio company of JP Morgan's infrastructure investment fund, and I led deal work there, so negotiating large transactions and such. And then ultimately partnered up with New Founding 3 years ago, and have done a number of things with them, but most recently launched a real estate private equity fund, which I'm running out here in Tennessee. Now, along the way, again, with my business partner, Nate Fisher, co-founded American Reformer. This is a nonprofit that it was born in 2021. It was born, I think, after a year in which there was widespread dissatisfaction amongst the laity and how institutional leaders within the church responded to a number of very tough cultural tests that were presented in 2020. You could talk about the pandemic. You could talk about the summer of Floyd and all of the related flare-ups. You could even talk about the contested election. And it was a time where we thought that evangelical leadership, Protestant leadership, was lacking in a lot of the highest places of power and culturally significant institutions. And we wanted to change that. We wanted to create an organization that would help to elevate a new generation of leaders for the church.
Yeah, wonderful. One thing I'm curious. Tell us just a moment. Take a moment to tell us a little bit about your family.
Yes. So I was married right after undergraduate. So I was married as a young master's student at Catholic University, and We had our first baby in law school, and then today I have four children. My oldest is 10. We currently homeschool them. Um, I love classical education, and I'm seriously considering that for the future. But yeah, I have four
Well,
wonderful
classical
children.
education happens at home as much as it does anywhere else.
Yes. Well, and we've certainly gleaned a lot from various resources on, how to instill a love for the classics and critical thinking and such. But yeah.
Very good. So American Reformer was formed as a way of addressing some cultural concerns. Tell me, maybe the best place to start is to start kind of at the end. What does success look like for the organization as you see it? What would you say makes it having accomplished what you set out to accomplish?
Success would look like, very tersely, Protestant Christians exercising political and cultural leadership, especially on the political right. When we looked around a couple years ago when we co-founded American Reformer, we saw some wonderful organizations doing great work. For example, Heritage and Kevin Roberts.
Mhm.
Or if we even look at the Supreme Court, we see some wonderful justices, all of whom are Catholic. And so we really want to elevate good Protestant voices in the public square for leadership, and we think that that's actually necessary for helping to seek national renewal in America, because of its Protestant history and legacy. The conservative movement, we think, really needs to be led by Protestants who have a message and a theological understanding that resonates with the broadest portion of the country. So, success would look like a new generation of leaders leading institutions, doing public thinking, and then rising through elite ranks into important roles in American society.
Okay, that is interesting. And as you probably know, at Veritas, we are a Protestant organization. We're Reformed.
Hmm.
We the overwhelming number of families that connect with us and are in our online school and buy our curriculum are Protestant. But you're making a case that's a little different than one that I've ever thought through before. And I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit more. Why is it, help us understand at a principled, maybe even kind of bullet pointed level, why the distinctively Protestant community needs to establish a level of prominence in cultural leadership.
Yeah, well, the Protestants, if we just look at sort of the basic demographics of this country, the Protestant Christians make up the biggest voting faction, and of the right. And um, and of course you could, and that observation leads into a lot of other things, like you've got the Southern Baptist Convention, these other evangelical behemoths that retain a social sort of the social standing and engagement in American civic society that's widely distributed, and they have numbers that even the Catholics cannot compete with. And of course, if you look at polling on the behavior of course, there's some wonderful Catholics, but if you look at polling on the average behavior of Protestants relative to mainlines or Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, you'll see that Protestant Christians in America they are the backbone, they are the demographic foundation that really is keeping America relatively sane. They're the bulwark against increasing insanity. And so we think, given that fact, we need people in leadership who understand, how to work with Protestants. And then, just to talk about some particulars, in the Catholic world, there's been a lot of intellectual agitation on the question of post-liberalism. I think those are very interesting debates, right? So you have Patrick Deneen writes the book Why Liberalism Failed. Very important book. People should go read it. But amongst certain quarters of call it the conservative intelligentsia, there's increased skepticism about the founding and even in some understandings of seeing the founding as an outgrowth of the Reformation, which is itself an outgrowth of modernity, and things that all need to be sort of rejected hook, line, and sinker. And so I think that, we can say as Protestants, we can be involved in the post-liberalism discourse, but we can also say, yeah, no, America is a Protestant project from its founding. That does mean it's different than other pre-modern Christendom societies. Um, and there were some really good things about that. We can defend the founding in a way that I think is different than many modern Catholic intellectuals would want to. And it's a way that resonates with the people who vote and the people who create American culture at scale.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting thought, and something I hadn't really thought through as much as I probably should. That is something for us to consider. We've got the sheer volume, the number of people, and they need to be provided direction. And I suspect there's some ideological reasons that you would say that too, that come out of the founding. But let me go a little different direction here with that. So if what we need is a recovery of that leadership of that largest conservative block of people, what would you say the reason is that it has lost its influence or it has faltered? My sense is anytime we see a problem, we need to know what we're looking for as a solution, which you've articulated. But now tell me how we got where we are. Why did the problem exist? Because that helps us correct path as well.
There's lots of interesting work done on this question. My personal view is that the liberal fundamentalist split in the 1920s decapitated Protestants, by which I mean most of the elites went along with the main line into theological liberalism. They retained some power through the 1960s and then totally cratered as the WASP establishment and the elites in the Northeast simply just failed, and the theological liberalism, of course, leads to impotent churches that lose people. It turns out if you don't have believers who really believe they're meeting to worship
there's no
the
reason
creator
to
of the
be there, and
universe.
eventually they figure that out.
Yes. So I think the theological explanations are a huge part of that story. And yeah, so we have the fundamentalists, and they hold fast to, the truths of Scripture and the gospel. But they are definitely a downscale, down market movement that is somewhat situated in the backwoods at more at the fringes of society. And so I think that's the big reason. Meanwhile, the Catholics in America have always been, especially at the elite levels, they operate like a very well organized minority group, and they look out for each other's interests, and they don't. This is really crucial. They don't have this stark. They don't have the stark elite versus grassroots divide that we see amongst Protestants.
Yeah, there is far more fracturing within the Protestant the post-Reformation Protestant church than there is in Catholicism, for sure. And of course, the reasons are fairly obvious. The Catholic Church is fairly monolithic in its governance, and has been one of the reasons why it's remained together, where Protestants have been fractured, and I assume that would contribute to a lack of cohesive leadership then too, that there are a lot of voices and a lot of perspective, and maybe that results in infighting.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do think that's right. And I would say some of the largest faithful denominations, I think they have room to grow. So, this is I'm a Southern Baptist myself, And this is the largest Protestant denomination in the country. It has 13 million people. It has very vast resources, and it's the de facto mainline in a lot of the Southeast. If you go to small towns in the Southeast,
It
First
dominates.
First Baptist Church on Main Street is Southern Baptist, and they still hold to Orthodox positions. Um, and I think that we need to see a renewal in denominations like that to have more public-mindedness, for this country. That doesn't mean every pastor needs to become a politician, certainly not. But they need to instill in their members this vision that as Christian men, and perhaps particularly for laymen, men who are not pastors, but they have a vocation to serve the public square, to mind Main Street, and also have a mind to future generations.
Yeah, that's really good. We're going to run out of time, and there are other things I want to cover, but we could make a couple episodes out of just that topic. Now, wokeness has become a popular term, and of course, we've seen it in public education, but also in private education. Talk to me first about how you all see what you're doing at American Reformer to inform that that phenomenon. I'm not sure what to call it, and how you're shining light on it in an effort to see righteousness prevail.
Yes, I mean, we really see wokeness as a canary in the coal mine. So, we don't want to be merely anti-woke, because being merely anti-woke is reactionary, negative
You kill the
thinking,
canary,
right?
you don't have anything other than problems in the
Yes,
metaphor.
yes. Yes, exactly. So we see, I understand wokeness to be something of a successor religion to Christianity in America. So some of the excesses that we see in public, and you really saw this during the George Floyd riots, but there's a quasi-religious fervor to it. It's in some ways a heresy of Christianity. It's taking concepts of guilt and innocence and creating new types of rituals around it. But it has a very different moral framework, of course, at its very fundamental premises. I highly recommend the book by Josh Mitchell, American Awakening, on this point. He's a political philosophy professor at Georgetown, actually, but a good, staunch conservative Protestant, actually, great voice. He's done wonderful work on this question. But yeah, wokeness, in my view, is a quasi religious movement that is actually a competitor to Christianity, and somewhat parasitic of Christian concepts in strange ways. So yeah, we need of course we oppose wokeness in Christian institutions. It's in Christian institutions, I think, in large part because Christian institutions are not islands. They have to do business with all these different sets of constituencies, right? They have students, like a school has students and parents. It has vendors. It has donors. Maybe it has board members who work at Goldman Sachs, and they're worried about headline risk, and so that translates into pressure on the institution. And as we've moved into an era where wokeness is becoming more the consensus public orthodoxy, it's getting a lot harder for Christian institutions who are plugged into all of these constituencies to maintain mission. There's pressures on them. So, take example, again, the example of the board member. When I worked at a big law firm, I would have been very reticent to be a public board member of certain organizations I would have wanted to be involved with because of the headline risk that would create. And if I had been a board member, I would have been constantly pushing that organization to not be in the news, to be very careful.
Right.
Don't be too out front about what you believe. And this is I think it's a strategy question for Christians in America.
That's the exact
Yeah.
word that came to mind. We're talking about serious strategic considerations. I can
Yeah.
be certain that if I'm a board member of a Christian institution that feels like it needs to be friendly at some level to woke thinking for whatever the reason might be, I know that doesn't end well.
Well, but that's we have the strategy, and like I followed this, right? A lot of people my generation did. We had the James Davison Hunter faithful presence model in mind. We there's a huge generation of talented, high-performing Christians who chased elite credentials and got into elite institutions. And I mean, I think like a lot of them haven't compromised. I'm not saying they've like personally compromised or
Right.
anything, but at scale, it's a question of allocation of resources. And then all of those people are like sort of natural board members or leaders for Christian institutions, but they have severe pressure points because, again, the public orthodoxy is really now wokeness in a sense.
Yeah.
And so, in all these various ways, they're going to have pressures at least to kind of mute and soft pedal Christian distinctives. Um, so I think that what that really means is Christian institutions need to get a lot savvier about like, what does it do to my organization if I put the CEO of a Fortune 500 on my board? What kind of pressures will that bring to my organization? And I think these institutions are waking up to that.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with being patient at times where we don't know all the implications. And I hear some wisdom in what you're saying. And I certainly expect you would agree that anybody that's in a large organization forced into leadership and has to operate with certain unfortunate parameters, that we can expect that the likelihood of that ending well is slim. Some people in our audience know this, but my wife, Laurie, my business partner, and we've been married for 43 years. She was a Division I sprinter in college. And she was slightly before Title IX, so she likes to talk about the fact that she had to be in the gym at 5 a.m. so the guys could have it at 6:30 or 7. They needed to be out of the way ahead of time. Well, one of the things that she and I talked about is we've seen things like men saying that they're women and participating in women's sports. Well, my conclusion very quickly was, and she and I really agree to this, the answer was to say, we're not going to run. We can't compete. We shouldn't compete. It's not a reasonable competition. And so we're simply going to say, that's not for us. Get it cleaned up and we'll come back, but this is what needs to happen. And we see that happening now increasingly. And I expect by the end of 2025, we'll see a lot of that. And all of a sudden, either the sport doesn't exist or it exists in a way that's reasonable and respects the differences. There's just no way that in certain sports, men and women can compete fairly. And if somebody is physiologically a man claiming to be a woman, it won't work.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such an excessive expression, I think, of wokeness, right? But it's illustrative of like sort of the core conceit, which is it's really this hubristic attempt to escape all givenness of human nature. If you're, we as conservatives, particularly as Christians, we believe there's such a thing as human nature that's embedded with a teleology, an orientation towards certain ends. We believe that that there's a blueprint out there that is embedded in us as creatures that God put in us, that is the roadmap for the well-lived life, for eudaimonia. And the left and its kind of corresponding woke religion, it has really elevated this idea of the individual who can escape any unchosen condition that they happen to be born into. So, oh, you don't like the way your body is, it doesn't correspond to, some changing fluid conception of gender, you can change it. And I do think some of the momentum on that is receding simply because it's so insane. I'm maybe a little bit more I'm somewhat optimistic that the tides will turn on that particular question. But yeah, the core problem will continue, which is
So you don't
uh,
think that
yeah.
that receding will have a trickle-down effect and a reversal in a broader way?
Not without some more fundamental changes.
Okay.
I think that the core conceit remains this idea that the expressive individual must be able to overcome any sort of unchosen aspect of their nature. And so it's a black eye. It's a reversal perhaps on one little flare point. But unless we, do real work, reversing some of the bedrock assumptions that drive postmodern American society, there will be other flare points.
Yeah, interesting. I hate to do this, but we're going to change topics again a little bit, but it brings us into an area that's obviously very closely related. You wrote an article that I found wonderfully on point and very much in affinity to what we do. And I couldn't agree with you more. The article's titled, "We Are Going to Win. The Christian Education Movement is Working." Tell me what inspired you to write that, what you've learned about areas of Christian education, specifically what's happening in classical Christian education, because we see it in spades. I think I'm getting a lot of data from what I do in seeing how it will influence culture in a very significant way, so much so that it affects our mission, which is restoring culture to Christ, one young heart and mind at a time. Tell me what your thoughts are and what you've observed that caused you to write that.
So it's deeply personal for me. I've long been annoyed when I see there's, on occasion there's like these high profile defections, people who received some type of a Christian education, and then they they change their minds, they change course, and they do some high profile defection. They write a breathless tell-all memoir, and it's national news. And I've always really disliked that because I think those people are extreme outliers. Okay.
They are.
And on the other hand, I'm the product of Christian education. I'm deeply grateful to parents who sacrificed a lot to give it to me. My wife and I are sacrificing a lot for our children to give it to them. All of our friends are in the same position. And, looking at the broader social landscape, I've concluded, what's happening is really, well, there's two things. One, the left in elite circles is increasingly perceiving Christian education as a serious political threat to its social goals. And that's, I think, appropriate threat detection. I think that's absolutely right. It is an increasing threat. Like, amen, may it be so. And then correspondingly, this is why there's demand for these, tell-all memoirs and these attempts they're attempts to demoralize Christian parents, and it's really insidious because sometimes you even see it in the church. I mean, I in part wrote in reaction to a piece in Christianity Today that sort of made the argument that, oh, you should send your kids to public school, and if you send them to Christian school, it may not make much of a difference. I think that's completely wrong-headed. And it's particularly tough because, look, there's a lot of Christians who make serious sacrifices for Christian higher education. There's a lot of, I know a lot of blue collar people who work double shifts and this sort of thing to be able to afford classical Christian schools. Or like there's a lot of, homeschooling families that are just working themselves to the bone. And I wanted to say to them, that matters. Like that's, what you are doing works. Yeah. And it could be part of national renewal. Like it's that scale. So, there's various different estimates. I use sort of a back of the envelope. Let's call it 5 million kids who are being homeschooled or in some form of Christian education, a lot of classical Christian ed in there. That's roughly 10% of the forthcoming generation. That's a big demographic slice.
And when you start then accounting for the number of children that they will have compared to their counterparts,
yes,
it becomes 2 or 3 times that very quickly.
Yes. I mean, you dig into the fertility rates and it's night and day. Generally speaking, America's well below replacement rate now. And the Christian education people, they're extreme outliers on fertility. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, this has been incredible. Let me just encourage our listeners and the people watching us to look for that article and to learn a bit more about American Reformer. and to enjoy what you're doing, because I think you have got some wonderful insights and will prove to be a wonderful contributor to a reformation and a restoration of things that truly need to be reformed and restored. So thank you, Josh. Thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Marlon.
Yeah, great to have you here. Folks, thanks again for joining us on another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.